Vaping is rapidly taking over the smoking scene, touted as a healthier way of curbing cigarette addiction. And with it, the public discourse around this so-called therapy product has been getting heated, with misinformation spouted on both sides. We all probably know that vapes aren't the greatest for you, but could they actually be making addiction worse? Vaping is the new cool kid thing to do. Whereas cigarettes were the symbol of cool for hundreds of years, vaping is considered a healthier way of curbing nicotine addiction while also retaining that sense of swagger. However, this so-called therapy product might actually be making addiction worse. To understand the popularity of vaping, you have to understand what it's replacing. The sexy, black and white, sophisticated whiskey drinking, poker playing cigarette. There are very few products that have shaped the world quite so much as tobacco. Now, people have been using the tobacco plant for medicinal and ceremonial purposes for a millennia. But when we started mass producing cigarettes in the late 1800s, they took on a cultural significance that still holds true today. For hundreds of years, cigarettes were just what you did, and the social power of this habit became so integral to so many cultural cliches over the years that you'd think it was perfectly natural. But of course, that is not the case. Since this is not a video about tobacco, let's summarize a few things. See, tobacco on its own is not necessarily the nicest thing to inhale into your body all day. And as a result, it probably wouldn't have become as popular if it were not for two things: chemical additives and widespread availability. Big tobacco started cramming all sorts of weird shit into cigarettes to make them burn better, taste better, and deliver nicotine to your brain better than ever before. All of this at a dirt cheap cost so that absolutely everybody could afford them. With that kind of combo, you probably don't even need to advertise your product, but greedy corporate hogs are gonna be greedy corporate hogs, and since the early days, cigarette companies did everything they could to shove these things down the throats of every man, woman, and child for as long as they could, even to the point of selling cigarettes as a cure for asthma, of all things. By the 1950s, Hollywood stars and anyone of social importance was smoking, and it was not only normal, but the cool thing to do. Now today, as you know, there has been a war waged against smoking in all forms. The effort to villainize cigarettes has been a harrowing one, but that sophisticated smoker connotation has never totally left our imagination. Maybe most of us are no longer super willing to pick up a cigarette just to look like a tough guy, but we now have vapes that have come to our rescue. You can dabble with that cool tough guy persona, minus the decades-long association with lung cancer. But before you start buying skinny jeans and leather jackets, you kind of want to know, like, what is a vape? Vapes, as I have learned, come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some of them are laughably large and actually need to be kept on a desk or table. I think if I need to smoke something that physically I can't hold in one hand, I need to reevaluate my life choices. But whether this thing is the size of an ice cream pail or a pen in your pocket, the basic idea behind all of them is to vaporize a liquid so you can breathe it in without burning anything else or having any smoke in your lungs. The liquid is typically made of a solvent like propylene glycol, chemical flavors, and some kind of special ingredient, probably nicotine or THC. This mixture is then heated to form a breathable aerosol that gets absorbed into the bloodstream by your lungs, where the drugs work out the desired effect. Which I have to say does sound a lot more pleasant than smoking a cigarette. You can get all sorts of fancy flavors for these products, and sure, there's still chemicals involved, of course, we're gonna get into that, but only a fraction of the 7,000 chemicals in a cigarette. Vaping ends up being somewhat healthier, dramatically cheaper, and far less taboo than cigarettes. And as a bonus, it doesn't come with discarded cigarette butts being tossed everywhere. This is seriously the thing I understand the least about smoking. How did it become normal to just toss a smoking piece of toxic waste onto the sidewalk or the beach or into the mouth of a baby bird? Cigarette butts are the most littered thing in the world, and it gets me riled up. God, I feel like such a dad right now for saying that.
Hey guys, You don't know me yet, but my name is Cher and I'm the host of Future Proof Health, the younger, cooler version of this channel where we talk about everything health related. I'm super excited and a little nervous because we are going live real soon. If you want to be a part of our journey, click on the link in the description to check us out.
Overall, it seems that vapes are a win-win-win compared to cigarettes, which makes sense seeing as vapes, as we know them, were literally invented to help smokers manage addiction. Inventors have been toying with the idea here and there since 1927, but e-cigs as we know them were invented by a Chinese smoker and pharmacist named Han Lick, who actually lost his father to lung cancer. So in 2003, Lick developed an e-cigarette to help himself quit smoking. Unfortunately, it didn't quite turn out the way that he expected. With vapes being the new and exciting fad that they are, it is not super easy to say precisely how effective they have been at combating addiction, especially in comparison to other more long-standing methods. At this point, there's some evidence that vaping can be of assistance, especially when used in conjunction with professional help and other types of therapies. Although, often smokers who try vaping without that kind of holistic support and robust treatment plan have just ended up vaping and smoking, which is exactly what happened to Han Lick himself. But where vapes are actually more concerning is when it comes to non-smokers. Many contain nicotine, which is what makes cigarettes so addictive in the first place. People who are wary of smokers for their addictive and damaging qualities may end up gravitating to vapes instead, being the less concerning option with supposed therapeutic benefits. However, a lot of them find themselves addicted to that instead, which in the long run makes them a lot more susceptible to cigarette addiction down the road. Now, for most of us, when we hear that, we think, gosh, that is just so unfortunate. How do we not see that coming? And Big Tobacco is sitting in the corner of the room, laughing maniacally, because this is a feature, not a bug. As we all know, smoking has long been a mega lucrative business. By now, most of us have at least some sense of how much power tobacco companies have wielded over the last century or so, and just how motivated they've been to keep us coming back for more. But despite all their shady shenanigans to prevent this, word got out about just how destructive cigarettes are to the human body, and in the past few decades, we've done a tremendous job stamping down Big Tobacco's reign. Government regulations have crippled tobacco sales, restricting how and where they can be sold. And of course, everybody has probably seen those horrific advertisements featured on the packages themselves with like shriveled black lungs and whatnot. Whatever you think of these tactics, they worked. Within decades, smoking went from normative to taboo across North America, with cigarette sales absolutely plummeting. So you can imagine Big Tobacco's sheer bliss when a new addictive nicotine-based product launched with a clean slate, no stigma, and better yet, no regulations. So you should not be surprised at all to know every single big tobacco company in the world owns a line of vapes. But the reasons why come down to the rules around vaping and the gray area that they exist within. You know how we said earlier that cigarettes have over 7,000 chemicals in them? Well, we know this because the US government made laws that required tobacco companies to disclose detailed information about what was in their products. Armed with this information, many places now tax the hell out of cigarettes to discourage people from buying them, and those things help public coffers in the process. But today, the vape horse is out of the gate already, and the government barely even knows that the race is on yet. The business opportunity of vapes is just pure gold. Before governments can even say red tape, vape companies were busy reinventing the nicotine craze, selling themselves not just as a way to quit smoking, but as a relaxing and totally safe recreational activity in its own right. In this frantic race to gain market share before the government knew what was happening, things got pretty sketchy, and probably most notably with a certain company called Juul. Juul e-cigarettes haven't been around very long, just since 2015, but in a short time they managed to capture modern American youth culture to the point where the word Juul became a verb. These devices resemble a little USB stick or an iPod, a familiar and apparently appealing shape for the modern tech-savvy teen. As a bonus, they are very small, discreet, unassuming, and can be easily passed off as just another piece of tech. This manipulative design isn't itself a crime, but Juul took it a step further by hiring social media influencers on places like Instagram and TikTok, where the young hang out and the parents avoid, and started posting their own ads that seemed to specifically target youth culture. There is actually a story where apparently a Juul representative actually went into a high school. There he informed the kids about how totally safe their products were. I guess he kind of failed to mention that Juul pods actually contained more nicotine than not just regular cigarettes, but every other vape on the market, and in a more potent form. By this we mean that Juul pods contained as much nicotine, if not more, than a pack of cigarettes. 3 times as much as is allowed in the EU, so not exactly safe per se. It's a blatant attempt to create a new generation of nicotine-addicted customers, and sadly, it worked. By 2018, just 3 years later, Juul accounted for over 70% of the US e-cigarette market, and teenage vaping was at an all-time high. By this point, people finally started to figure out what was happening, and the lawsuits started piling in for their nicotine content and their advertising. In the last few years, Juul has had to delete their social media accounts, totally change their advertising, include warning labels, and pay out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements. In less than 2 years, their value went down 85%, and things just keep getting worse since then. Warms your heart, doesn't it? Now perhaps you just took a fat haul off of your Volcano hybrid desktop vaporizer and gave Thomas the Tank Engine a run for his money.
Oh, scissors and ashes!
All the while with the confidence that vaping is way better than smoking, bro. Well, Dylan, the reality is vaping is just not good for you. Nicotine, as we know, can cause behavioral and emotional problems in youth, including anxiety and depression. Not that they weren't already struggling with those things, but it doesn't make them better. And then there's all those other weird chemicals and flavors in the aerosol, some of which have been linked to cancer and other diseases, and we don't know what those are going to do to your body. Not to mention the unlabeled contents, which if you buy a vape from a sketchy street vendor in a trench coat, it could be very well contaminated with who knows what. But honestly, if you're buying anything from a person wearing a literal trench coat, you probably have bigger problems than not being able to find the vape sauce flavor that you want. Because here's the thing, regulation is still lacking, and governments in charge of this stuff haven't been able to rein in the craze. Even if you buy from a legitimate source, not everything might be included on the label. The CDC reports that in some cases, products don't label their nicotine content at all, or even flat out lie about it. So some unsuspecting customer may end up inhaling an addictive substance that they never even knew that they were risking. But what's perhaps scariest of all is that vaping is such a new fad that nobody knows the long-term consequences. We can hope for the best, but the reality is things could be much, much worse. Already we are seeing hospitalizations and deaths related to vaping, prompting the FDA to call it an actual epidemic, which I know today with all of the unprecedented levels of unprecedented epidemic-like events, that term has sort of lost some of its weight, but it is still kind of crazy. But perhaps you don't care about your physical well-being, you just want to look cool so you can maybe get laid or look like some of the characters in Mad Men. The thing you really care about is the planet. You don't want to look like an asshole just throwing cigarette butts out the window of your car as you're driving down the highway. And for that, I commend you. You sound like an amazing person. But I have some bad news. The cartridges that you use for refills are one of the most common ways to get the vape sauce into your system. And those things, more often than not, just get tossed in the trash. Sure, they're not being left on the beach as often, and there is far more puffs per cartridge than a single cigarette, but you're still buying disposable cartridges. Or worse, disposable vapes, an increasingly common thing, sadly. And this doesn't just suck from an environmental standpoint either. When you're buying branded refills, you are always going to be paying a premium for it. We made a whole episode about coffee pods, and coffee pods is just an analogy for almost anything that involves refills. Go and watch that video, subscribe to the channel, and we can talk about it. Yes, of course, there are some refillable tank options, so you're not throwing out a pod or the entire device every time that you're done, but that's not really the whole problem either, is it? Because now you're buying this giant tabletop volcano smoke device that didn't even need to be there in the first place. In response to all of this suck-assery, we have been seeing governments worldwide start cracking down on the so-called e-cigarette epidemic. Many of these tactics look pretty familiar. In Canada, it's now illegal to sell vapes to the underage. Some places have started taxing the living shit out of them. And we can expect that as time goes on, these devices are going to be treated more and more like cigarettes. Their popularity will probably go down, but sadly by then, vapes will already be a pretty ingrained part of modern youth culture. And more likely than not, they'll just be a new, tempting, equally dangerous, tobacco-funded addiction down the road that will replace it when it loses its fashion. So maybe you just don't need to buy a vape. If you are concerned about your health or the environment or anything in between, vaping in general just seems like a bad idea. But obviously vaping is very different in every part of the world, so let us know what the situation looks like where you live down in the comments. We would love to read that. Contribute to our Reddit if you have any other things that you'd like to hear us talk about, and subscribe to the channel so you can check us out for the next episode.